Welcome again to the Economic Forum. Today we are going to look at the misconceptions surrounding the IMF, which in our view is fueled by politicians who do not want to be scrutinized. Development economists were skeptical about the markets during the 1960s and 1970s. During this period, protectionist policies provided the most effective way of fostering industrialization and encouraging growth, also known as the planning approach. The approach became influential in Africa after it was emerging from a long colonial period. Most African leaders at the time had attended UK schools influenced by Fabian's socialist ideas, leading to the implementation of different variants of the policy. During this period, accumulation of capital was the main source of economic growth, based mainly on the Harrow-Dorman model. Policies aimed at raising the aggregate savings and investment ratios were considered fundamental to any successful development strategy. In that vein, countries with very low domestic savings were expected to be supplemented with foreign savings in a form of foreign aid. Since the global demand for developing countries' export or commodities had a low income elasticity, and that of advanced countries' manufactured goods had high income elasticity, the term of trade of developing countries are likely to experience a secular deterioration. This observation called for a rapid industrialization process in developing countries. The policy of import substitution became prominent as advocates called for trade restrictions to be used to protect and encourage sectors with strong forward and backward linkages. Proponents of this ideology assumed the complexity of these linkages away, making its implementation unsuccessful as import exemptions became very high in those countries. Recipients of aid are likely to experience a real exchange rate appreciation or loss in competitiveness, which did not seem to have happened in most African countries. This is often attributed to black markets and controlled prices. Cumulatively, total aid to Africa in today's dollars from 1960 to 2006 is an impressive $714 billion. Models most often cited by those who predict large effect of Western efforts on Africa are models of poverty traps and multiple equilibria, in which Africa's adverse initial conditions are both the explanation for Africans' poverty and the potential lever by which Africa can be transformed by making direct money transfers or by directly improving an input into development outcomes. The poor performance of countries in Africa had been, but not exclusively, the result of bad policies that put the interests of bureaucrats ahead of those of the people, shifting incentives for growth, innovation and productivity improvement in the agricultural sector. Government officials had captured state apparatus and were using it for their own benefit as well as for that of their immediate supporters, families and friends. This led to people questioning the effectiveness of aid in Africa. Advocates called for greater flexibility in terms of the use of aid funds and an increased coordination across donors, leading to a doubling of aid in real terms. In fact, most African countries demanded that Bretton Woods institutions accept that failures in aid policies were in part the consequence of their own misguided advice, blaming external factors for the ineffectiveness of aid. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, the International Monetary Fund played an increasingly important role in defining overall aid policies. Its seal of approval was needed for other multilaterals to release their monies. Fund conditionalities was controversial, as more often than not, it focused on devaluation, the elimination of subsidies, and the control of parastatals. Throughout the 1980s, a number of politicians and economists from around the developing world condemned the existing international economic order and demanded major reforms that would give third world nations greater say on international issues. In many ways, this anti-IMF sentiment was the result of the Mexican crisis and the insistence by the fund that Mexico and other Latin American nations put their house in order and implemented massive devaluations before receiving major assistance and debt forgiveness. Meetings criticizing the IMF became common. Papers discussed in this fora had titles such as "The Splendid Isolation of the IMF," "The Congenital Inability of the IMF to Deal with Development Problems," and "Swallowing the IMF Medicine in the 1970s. One of the main complaints about the IMF was that it imposed policies without consulting the countries in question and without engaging in a deep policy dialogue. The perception that most of the reforms were from the Bretton Woods institution were largely inaccurate. Most of the reforms in the late 1980s and early 1990s were largely homegrown and were the response to general long periods of generalized crisis. In some instances, the Bretton Woods institutions were skeptical with some of the proposed reforms. Even though the Bretton Woods institutions were championing some policies, there were subtleties and complexities of the actual individual country stories. In many instances, privatization was surrounded by corruption and giveaways where insiders, including government functionaries in charge of the public enterprises and of the sales of products, ended up buying large blocks of the shares at conveniently low prices. However, critics of the IMF placed the failure of such programs entirely on the doorsteps of the IMF. The IMF has 190 members or countries out of the 195 countries in the world. The largest borrower are Argentina, Egypt, Ukraine, and Pakistan. The largest precautionary loans have been disbursed to Mexico, Chile, and Colombia. When a country joins the IMF, it agrees to subject its economic and financial policies to the scrutiny of the international community. It also makes a commitment to pursue policies that are conducive to orderly economic growth and reasonable price stability, to avoid manipulating exchange rates for unfair competitive advantage, and to provide the IMF with data about its economy. The IMF's regular monitoring of economies and associated provisions of policy advice is intended to identify weaknesses that are causing or could lead to financial and economic instability. This process is known as surveillance. Country surveillance is an ongoing process that culminates in regular, usually annual, comprehensive consultation with individual members countries, with discussions in between as needed. The consultations are known as the Article 4 consultation because they are required by Article 4 of the IMF's Articles of Agreement. Literature has failed to produce positive causal effects of aid on growth that survive the robustness checks, failing to confirm the prediction of big push models. Thus, though Africa is the most aid-intensive continent, Africa's growth outcomes have been unequally poor and non-inclusive. Led by economists Burnside and Dollar, there was a new aid theory premised on the fact that growth in developing countries can only increase when the recipient country had good policies, low inflation, and low budget deficits. This argument led to the creation of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, a US government agency designed to give aid to countries with good policies. Ownership was argued as a way of giving aid programs and reforms legitimacy and credibility, and would reduce the likelihood of resistance and reversion. Both skeptics and defenders of aid believe that bureaucratic assistance using aid is destined to be ineffective and wasteful. Also, as a result of the success of Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan, who received credit for an outward-oriented economy-wide policy, structural adjustment loans were initiated in Africa and other regions. They were intended to be emergency loans, and their repetition was not envisaged in their design. Despite these interventions, these debts had to be written off through HIPC initiative as debt levels reach unsustainable levels. Today, debt ratios are rising to pre-HIPC levels in these countries that benefited from debt forgiveness, mainly due to their aggressive entry into the capital markets or commercial markets. The IMF, the World Bank, and other bilateral donors provide concessional financing which come with very low interest costs. Non-concessional financing like the Eurobonds come with high financing costs. Only reason why countries will prefer the expensive borrowing to the IMF type of borrowing is due to the fact that most countries in sub-Saharan Africa want to avoid the scrutiny that comes with such borrowings. Countries only turn to the IMF when the economic situation becomes worse and will either have to undergo serious restructuring to get out of the woods. The question is, why don't they seek advice and technical support from the IMF when the economy is sound in order to prevent economic growth? Consider this example. A country spends more than it earns and have to borrow in order to pay its workers or even service its debts. If lenders realize you owe too much, then you may not be able to service additional borrowings and as a result refuse to lend you money. Do you need someone to tell you to live within your means and initiate steps to bring your economy back on track? And which lender will be willing to help you without making sure you are putting reforms in place to make sure you'll be able to repay funds given to you before they even consider lending you any funds? No country can borrow indefinitely. Sooner or later, surpluses will be needed to pay back the debts. This reality suggests a country will have to develop the discipline of knowing when debt becomes unsustainable and therefore the need for restraints. Failing that, lenders will impose the needed discipline when finances cannot be mobilized or available only at prohibitive costs. Thank you for listening. Subscribe to this channel for more information and more news on Africa and the world over. Thank you.